But women's hip and thigh fat is just a completely different thing in terms of how it stores calories, how hard it is to get. And again, this is biologically, women's bodies want to store that in case women get pregnant. And your body doesn't care what you want. It doesn't care that you want to get lean for whatever reason.
It really comes down to what works for you and how better you can adhere to it. Another problem that seems to concern a lot of women, and that's cellulite.
Yes.
And a lot of people, and even men, don't understand what cellulite is actually. They think there's so many theories about what cellulite could be and how can you improve it or get rid of it. But you can't probably get rid of it completely because it's something that is, well, you explain it better than me. So what is cellulite and how can you do about it?
Well, so what it is, so fat cells have sort of a, there's a connected tissue mesh, like sort of a grid, just sort of all around our body. And some women have a thicker connective tissue than others. And that does, I think that's due to estrogen. And what happens is that basically the fat pushes through it. A female friend of mine in Canada, and I don't know culturally what any given country has. Over here, we do holiday ham, and they take sort of a big like pork loin and they put it in this super tight mesh, and it's sort of like the meat fat kind of squishes through the holes. And that's kind of what she described it like that. I'm like, I'm stealing that. That's kind of it's normal body fat kind of pushing through this connective tissue matrix. So what can be done about it? Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be much. Like there's been endless attempts, loofahs, creams, massage. Like in premise, I guess, if you could reduce the thickening of the connective tissue somehow, but that's really hormonal. And, I don't think there's not much you can do. Losing body fat will tend to improve it simply because, again, you just don't have as much kind of pushing through. But I think it tends to be very genetic. Hopefully someone will, things with, plastic surgery and body sculpting technologies are improving like by the month, like the stuff that's coming out that actually does work now, right? Stuff that like, I don't know if they got cryolipolysis where they basically freeze it and the fat cells die and go away. Laser sculpting, there are things like that coming. At the time, right now, I don't think there's really much. And whenever you read the studies on it, it's always like a clinic that does the treatment, did the studies, and then had one of the clinicians just kind of look at it and go, yeah, looks better. And I don't find that to be particularly accurate or particularly trustworthy as a data method. But really, sort of just losing fat in general. And I think you'll find that even very lean female athletes, if they had it when their body fat was higher, probably still have it to some degree. Yeah. But to my knowledge, there's not, unfortunately, a lot that can be done.
What about resistance training or gaining muscle around that area? Would that improve it as well?
I don't think so, because really you've got, muscle is sort of sitting underneath the body fat. If anything, and I don't think it shouldn't be significant enough to matter, but like in premise, if you were to gain muscle without losing body fat, it might put the body fat out a little bit more. I doubt it's not. I don't think it's going to have a very large role in that, but unfortunately not. It's just if women have that, at least I haven't looked very recently, but to my knowledge, very little that they've tried. France is obsessed with cellulite. Like all the treatments, I don't know what French are obsessed with body fat in general. A lot of the research on this stuff comes in. I don't know why, just cultural, I guess. But yeah, unfortunately, if you're prone to it, it just seems like there's not much that can be done right now.
Why is it different compared to men? Like men are less likely to have cellulite than women. Why would that be?
I think that's just due to having such generally lower estrogen levels. Men do make estrogen. They don't, and it gets during some men's estrogen levels are higher than women's during some parts of the menstrual cycle because women's are going up and down and up and down. But by and large, I think some men do. I have seen men occasionally that have more of a women's fat patterning. Right? Like typically men will carry fat around the midsection, stomach, low back, tend to be very lean in the legs. Women typically carry hip and thigh fat. Obviously breast is a storage of fat, but less around the midsection. But occasionally you will see men that have more lower body fat for whatever reason, whether it's genetic, whether it's because they have higher estrogen levels, it's probably a little bit of both. And it's not unheard of, but for some reason it seems to really predominate in the lower body for whatever reason. And men just don't store a lot of fat there, generally speaking. I personally, as just a personal example, my thigh skin fold is about 3 to 4 millimeters. It's basically, there's none. My body weight has ranged from 70 kilos when I was an endurance athlete up to at one point I was about 100 kilos. carrying a lot of abdominal fat. My thigh skin fold never changed. It never changed from 3 to 4 millimeters. Every bit of fat I put. Now my waist probably, gained, let's see, 2 centimeters an inch. I mean, my waist circumference probably went up, 15 centimeters from 70 to 100 kilos. But my thighs, that's genetic. That's just male body fat patterning generally. But when men do carry hip and thigh body fat, I do think you see it occasionally. Men just typically don't. Everything else, or so many other things, are different, and estrogen does affect connective tissue synthesis. It is involved. There are estrogen receptors in tendons and ligaments. It wouldn't surprise me that, and I'm sure there's some really good reason for it why women lay down connective tissue one way and men another way. But I actually have never looked into that, but I will now.
Now, another thing that I find that is very common to see, and I don't think it is just in women but also in men, is a stubborn body fat.
Yes.
I think some people think that cellulite is a stubborn body fat, and that's why they try to do as much as they can to get rid of the cellulite. Right. But a stubborn body fat is something completely different. How can we define stubborn body fat, and why is it stubborn in the first place?
Okay. So we used to think that all body fat was the same. And now we know that there's at least 3 different kinds, right? There's visceral fat, and this is the fat you put around your internal organs and gut. Typically, men have more of that. Women with polycystic ovary syndrome also develop that. And women after menopause may develop that when their hormones change. Then there's subcutaneous fat. That's the fat underneath the skin. And then there's what's called, depending on, it's either brown adipose tissue, beige adipose tissue, bright adipose tissue. I don't want to get, this is a special kind of fat that burns calories for heat. We used to think humans didn't have much of it. Now we know that we have some. How relevant it is still kind of up to debate. And it's only activated when we get cold anyway. But it was all sort of treated the same. And then at some point, I want to say the 70s or 80s, they started to realize that, okay, women and men get different diseases. Men are much more prone to heart attacks, cardiovascular disease when they're younger, whereas women generally are protected from that until menopause. So it was clear that at least the different fat patterning, that the more male fat patterning was more unhealthy than women's more typical hip and thigh fat patterning. So we started to look into it, and I don't want to get into like too many of the real details, but what it comes down to is body fat in different parts of the body differs in how easily it is to store fat, how easily it is to get the fat out of the fat cell so it can be used for energy, blood flow, and there's some other factors that aren't that interesting. And it varies across the body. So visceral fat, for example, a lot of blood flow. It's very easy to store calories in that area, but it's also very easy to get them out. Because the high blood flow, visceral fat is actually dumping a lot of fatty acids into the bloodstream. And that's part of why men are at a higher risk of certain diseases when they're younger, because that's not healthy if you're not burning them off. Abdominal fat is a little bit harder to get the fat out of the fat cells, a little bit poorer blood flow. And even there, abdominal fat can be divided into 3 different sections. So the deep fat, which is closer to the visceral fat, easier to mobilize, better blood flow. The upper abdominal area, a little bit harder to get out, a little bit lesser blood flow. The lower abdominal area, a little bit harder, right? And if you watch when people diet, right, when they diet to get lean, you kind of lose fat from the inside out and then the top down. Face starts to get drawn. This is very easy to get rid of. Women will just get like crazy veins and crazy cuts here. Unfortunately, breasts may shrink, and there's not a whole lot that can be done. If I haven't figured out how to prevent that on a diet, I'll make all the money, but I haven't figured that one out. Then women will, then like the upper abdominal area will come in, and then the lower abdominal area will come in. And men will do that too. Men ask me all the time, they're like, I've been dieting and I still have this fat around my lower abdominal and back area. What's wrong with me? And I said, well, you're a man. That's what's wrong with you. This is genetically how you store and release body fat. And then hip and thigh fat is the worst in all regards. In terms of the way it stores fat, it's very difficult to mobilize fat from that area for a bunch of boring, complicated reasons. Blood flow is very poor in and out of the area, right? And if you carry a good bit of hip and thigh, just put your hands there and it probably feels a little bit cold to the touch because it's got such poor blood flow. So even if you manage to get the fat out of the fat cell, if the blood flow is poor, it'll just go right back in. You need good blood flow to carry it away to get burned somewhere else. So and the reason men don't have men's stubborn fat is their lower abdominal area, but for men, it's just a matter of patience. If you just stick it out, it'll go away. But women's hip and thigh fat is just a completely different thing in terms of how it stores calories, how hard it is to get. And again, this is biologically, women's bodies want to store that in case women get pregnant. And your body doesn't care what you want. It doesn't care that you want to get lean for whatever reason. So under a lot of circumstances, you will end up with women that are, I mean, men are jealous, right? Men will look at women's abdominal area and just go, I would wish I had that. And women will look at men's thighs and go, I wish I had that. And thus the balance of the universe is maintained, right? The grass is always greener. And then cellulite is not, it is stubborn fat in that it is typically in the hips and thighs, usually like back of the hamstrings and glutes. But I don't know that it's specifically any more stubborn. It's just pushing through that connective tissue matrix that is hormonal. So yes, you've got all this going on that makes it more difficult to get the fat out of that area. This is especially true, and I know I'm going a little bit off topic, but this is always how I do it. A lot of it has to do, well, part of it is how women have traditionally approached fat loss has made it that much more difficult to get rid of hip and thigh fat. Because you look back at the 70s and 80s, even in bodybuilders, you would have women that were just ripped and their hips and thighs were still fat and carrying excess body fat. As one person I know put it looked like you'd stapled two different bodies together. It was that, but at the time, the way women dieted, very high carbohydrates, nothing but low intensity aerobic activity. Now in 2008, I want to say I wrote a book called The Stubborn Fat Solution. I chased down this project for like a decade. That's like I just kept reading research and accumulating little tidbits, and finally I was ready. And it took me like 2 weeks to write, but it was a 10-year project. And one of the things that I realized, and I've actually come up with some more recent research, when women do higher intensity activities, and by that I mean more intense weight training or like high intensity interval training, it generates a certain hormonal response. That makes it that helps to mobilize women's lower body fat. And I came across some studies later, actually after I'd released volume 1 of the women's book, that looked at that. Because they'll do these studies and with DEXA or whatever, and they'll go, okay, the women lost fat, but it was 90% from their upper body and 10% from their lower. And then a couple of the studies were like, yeah, but we had them do intense weight training, we had them do intervals. And it wasn't that they lost exclusively lower body fat, but the proportions were a lot better. And I think the difference now, right, because a lot of people you talk to go, oh, there's no such thing as stubborn fat. I don't see it. I don't see it in my people. But modern dieting practices tend to be much more moderated carbohydrates, higher protein, moderate dietary fat, and much more intense training. Women have sort of really adopted that high intense, rather than going and doing 2 hours on the treadmill at a low intensity to burn more fat, they're doing more intense stuff, whether it's CrossFit, whether it's in the weight room, and when you combine that with the moderate, it comes off to a greater proportional degree. Right? You still can't really spot reduce in the sense we tend to think of it. But it's just that rather than your upper body getting ripped before your legs do anything, it will come off to a greater proportional rate.
It makes sense. That makes sense a lot. Now, when it comes to getting rid of that stubborn body fat, how much of a role, you mentioned that you perhaps didn't mention them, but because this is getting a little bit more into the nitty gritty, but like beta and alpha receptors, yes, do they play an important role in this particular issue of stubborn body fat?
Yes, very much so. And this was the details I was hoping to avoid, but I'll be happy to talk about them. So there are receptors in the body for the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. We call them adrenaline and noradrenaline over here. Now, epinephrine is released from the adrenal gland, sort of the stress hormone, fight or flight hormone, gets into the bloodstream, kind of affects the whole body, right? Heart, muscle, anywhere that it gets to. There's also norepinephrine. This is released from the nerve terminal, so it's very localized, right? So if you've got a fat cell here and you've got a little nerve, and it releases norepinephrine, it'll affect right here. Now, there are receptors on every cell in your body, skeletal muscle, heart, lungs, fat cells, where these hormones bind. And they're called adrenoreceptors, right? They're adrenal hormone, adrenoreceptor. There's two major types. There's a beta receptor, there's an alpha receptor, and then there's multiple types of each, which is not really more detail. So think of the beta receptor as an accelerator, right? So when norepinephrine or epinephrine bind to a beta receptor, it speeds things up, right? Makes your heart beat faster, makes your muscles burn more calories. It accelerates fat breakdown in fat cells. The alpha receptors are a brake, like pushing the brake down on your car. So when they're activated, heart rate goes down, muscles burn less calories, fat mobilization is inhibited. The ratios of those alpha to beta receptors determine to a great degree how easily or what difficulty it is to mobilize the fat cells. Mobilize the fat out of the fat cells. And as it turns out, the easier to mobilize fat has more beta receptors than alpha receptors. And women's hip and thigh fat has 9 times as many alpha receptors, or up to 9 times, as it does beta receptors, which makes it extremely difficult to mobilize fat. And there's other, like I mentioned, there's other reasons. And actually the blood flow issue, blood flow is also controlled by alpha and beta receptors. Same thing. Beta receptors make blood vessels get bigger, so blood can go through. Alpha receptors make them shrink. So you've got this double effect at women's lower body hip and thigh fat, that if the alpha receptors are getting mostly activated, mobilization of fat goes down, blood vessels constrict, so there's poor blood flow, nothing happens. And without getting into far more complication, because I wouldn't be able to explain it correctly, high intensity activity, because of how the hormonal response sort of overwhelms the alpha receptors and gives that stimulus to the beta receptors to not only increase blood flow, but also help to mobilize the fat. And that's why that works.
Okay.
And so, yeah, so that's getting into the real nitty gritty of it. And other things affect this too. So I know I said that estrogen is generally good in terms of fat loss. Well, that estrogen peak right before ovulation causes women's lower body fat cells to make more alpha receptors.
Oh,
but it's not that, right, it's women can't win. You true, like, I'm half joking, but it's comparatively speaking, women just can't win. They just cannot get a break. But it's not that estrogen is causing the fat gain, but it's setting up her body so that if there's extra calories in the second half of the cycle, which the cravings, which the binge eating, which the hunger is promoting, which the progesterone is causing to activate fat storage, it's just setting her. Estrogen also actually makes the progesterone receptor more sensitive to progesterone. So it's not that estrogen is directly bad, but it can have some indirect effects by setting up a woman's body for fat storage in weeks 3 and 4 when her body wants her to eat more. So it really, yeah, it's a real triple whammy, unfortunately.
Let me ask you something. Is there any possibility that your body could change somehow the ratio of beta to alpha receptors in those areas? Is there any study about that particular, just to make your stubborn fat a little bit less?
It does change. It does change with like dieting and fat loss, and I haven't really looked into it in a while to be able to answer that well. So like probably yes and no, but I think it's something that's kind of out of our control. Some people do and some people don't. And I've never really found anything like supplement wise or dietary wise to really cause that. It's more that sort of you work around it and find ways to kind of overcome the problem. And I talk about other approaches in that Stubborn Fat Solution book. For whatever reason, very low carbohydrate diets seem to naturally inhibit alpha receptors. And I know that it gets a little confusing, right? So alpha receptors inhibit fat mobilization. If you inhibit an inhibitor, it's like multiplying 2 negatives together. So you get a positive effect. You basically prevent it from inhibiting. So that does it. A supplement I talked about called yohimbine that you'll see talked about. It inhibits it blocks alpha-2 receptors. It also improves blood flow. It also can cause anxiety in a lot of people, and it's not legal everywhere. But there's dietary ways. Really, I think the training protocols of what have changed the most. And what is interesting to me is I wrote that book in 2008, and last year, and the way my protocols work, you do the high intensity activity first, right? And that mobilizes the fat into the bloodstream. The thing is, you still have to burn it off and burn it for energy, or it will just get stored back again. Which also, women's bodies are better at that. Women's bodies are really good at releasing fat into the bloodstream and then just storing it back in the fat cell. Women's bodies can even take fat from the upper body and store it in the legs, right? Back in the day, women would be like, I'm dieting, I'm getting leaner up top, but my hips and thighs are getting fatter. And we all were like, no, that's not possible. You're in a deficit. You can't gain fat. And we were wrong. Women's bodies can actually take fat from their upper body fat cells and store them in the hips and thighs.
Okay.
Because women's bodies, man, y'all's bodies hate you. Men's bodies hate them, but women's bodies hate them more. Just because this is what your bodies are programmed to store calories well, spare calories when it gets the opportunity. Anyway, so the protocols I gave were to do this high intensity session. It can be a 10-minute interval session, high intensity weight training, and then you follow that up with some low intensity aerobic activity. So the high intensity mobilizes it. The lower, so doing 30 minutes of easy aerobics, treadmill, elliptical, whatever, after your weight training or after the interval workout. So then a study comes out, I want to say last year, and they were like, okay, let's test. And they did a high intensity interval protocol and then did an aerobic workout afterward. And they're like, burn more fat that way because you mobilized it first. And I go, y'all should just read my book. I wrote it 12 years ago. Like just 12 years ago, I already was there anyway. So that certainly works. And I think that's a big change in modern dieting practices, because I know physique coaches and they're like, I don't see stubborn fat in my female athletes. Right. Like I said, moderated carbohydrate intakes now. Women used to eat, 75% carbs, insufficient protein, insufficient fat, nothing but hours of low intensity cardio, which, to a point you brought, would raise cortisol, would cause all sorts of problems. And they were kind of doing, and don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing, women were following the advice they were given. Right? You can't know what you don't know, and that's what women were told to do. And also to cut calories as low as possible, do as much aerobic activity as you like. Every piece of advice they were given was really the opposite of what they should have been doing. And as soon as women, for whatever reason, they get into heavier weight training, they start eating more protein, they bring their carbs down a little bit, start training more intensely, it's like magic. It's like in 3 months, they see more progress than they saw in the previous 2 years of doing that. They feel better, their joints don't hurt. And so a lot of people, I think, in the modern era are just doing a lot of the things that when I recommended them were not common.
Now, following that up, now that you mentioned that women changing a little bit their practices in terms of dieting, what is your stance of utilizing reverse dieting for women that are chronically dieting? They always they always think they need to be eating 1,200 calories and they need to be dieting all the time. What happens when you start reversing them and putting them in more calories, more protein, more resistance training? What happens? What do you think that what could be the benefit of utilizing this tool in this sort of situation in women that are chronically eating poorly, very low calories?
Okay, so to really address that, I want to go off on sort of a short tangent on women's menstrual cycle dysfunction, because it's tied into this. Okay. So one thing that women run into when they diet very hard, do too much training, is they will have menstrual cycle dysfunction. They may lose it completely. In some cases, it may lengthen, something called oligomenorrhea. That's typically associated with polycystic ovary syndrome. That's something else. And there's a couple things that happen in the middle that can't really be seen very easily. Now, for years, they argue about why this. They started to see this in the 80s as women started to get into sport. They saw eating disorders, bone mineral density loss, and loss of the menstrual cycle. And it's a little more complicated than that, but the long and the short of it is there's something called energy availability, and that is calorie intake minus exercise calorie expenditure, right? So this isn't the same as calories in versus calories out. This is how much you're eating versus how much you're burning in exercise. And conceptually, what that represents is how many calories are left to your body to keep everything running, right? So your body has some calorie requirement just for basic function, right? To keep your heart beating, to keep your liver doing liver things, to keep your kidney doing kidney things, keep your brain functioning. And many of these are critical for survival, but many of them are not. What do some women report when they diet extremely? Hair loss, their nails stop growing well, right? Because that takes energy. And to your body, if your nails stop growing, you won't die. If your hair starts falling out, I mean, you won't die in a physical sense. It may be very emotionally stressful, but in like a physiological sense. Immune system function is compromised. The immune system uses a ton of calories. But in the short term, menstruation burns a lot of calories, right? Like I said, when women develop the endometrium, that can burn 1,400 extra calories a month. Also, if you're starving to death, not a good time to get pregnant because you won't have the calories to support development. So that shuts down. Now, along with this, you see this very stereotypical hormonal response. And it can happen very quickly. Women can actually impair their hormones within 5 days of excessive calorie restriction. 5 days of excessive calorie restriction. What you see is cortisol goes up, which can cause issues. Thyroid hormone goes down, which is very involved in metabolic rate. Insulin-like growth factor, which is involved in bone health, and a ton of stuff goes down. You see changes in a couple of hormones I didn't mention called luteinizing hormone, follicle. They control the other hormones for reproduction. And go to Wikipedia if you really care, but it's not. It just what they see is this hormonal shift. It's essentially a starvation response. 5 days. So you've got women that are chronically undereating, chronically overexercising, that have a low energy availability, energy expenditure. Even basal metabolic rate may be down because thyroid levels are down. If they lose their menstrual cycle, that's another 1,400 calorie burn every month from not developing an endometrium. Often NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, is low because they're just tired all the time. Their training suffers because they're not eating enough, so they can't train very intensely. So what happens when you start to raise their calories, maybe cut back on the excessive aerobics, What people often forget is that daily energy expenditure is not a fixed number. It is a moving target. And to a degree, it can adjust itself up or down to match eating and activity levels. And I think a lot of what you see happening is as women bring calories up and or decrease activity a little bit, they don't get that stress response, that chronic stress response, which is very, very unhealthy, right? Where they're stressed constantly from too much training, too little eating, not sleeping enough. Women have more stress than men in the day in general life, I firmly believe, for a number of reasons. Thyroid status improves, their training intensity goes up, so they're burning more calories. Cortisol levels go down, their NEAT probably goes up. And what they frequently find is that they're still maintaining at a significantly higher calorie intake because all of those negatives to their training, to their NEAT, to their hormone levels do get reversed in a sense.
And I would add something. I would add that because they're eating more and they feeling much better, they are more consistent. And
yes, absolutely.
And binging is like pretty much reduced at the minimum because they now have more calories to eat.
And it seems very illogical. And again, women have been told, we're told, just the less you eat, the better. One of my favorite stories. This is so Barbie, right? Barbie dolls. I'm never sure what gets to the rest of the world. There's a famous '60s Barbie doll, and it comes with a scale and a little book. And on the book it says how to lose weight. And you turn it over and it says stop eating. This is not a joke. Someone at the Mattel or whoever makes Barbie thought that this was a good idea, and it got pulled off the market very quickly. But that's what women are told. So yeah. So what you're getting at, which is absolutely right. So let's say a woman is like, okay, I'm gonna eat 1,200 calories a day, and she does that for a few days, and then she binges, has a stressful day, whatever. Now she eats 2,000 or more, depending. Right. And then she goes right back. Okay, now I'm gonna eat 1,000 calories a day to make up for that. And then binges again. And you're seeing these huge, if you look at the average over a week, on top of the psychological stress, because when people binge, they're just like, I'm weak, I can't do this. It turns into a big psychological cycle. Whereas if you go, okay, let's target 1,500 or 1,800, whatever the number is. And then suddenly, because they're not hungry all the time, they can actually stick to that consistently. And if you actually look at the deficit over the week, it's actually bigger than when they're doing the extreme binging approach. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and even more when you change your mindset to be more flexible and allow yourself to include certain things that you probably would deem as bad. Now they don't look at as bad, but now they are actually possible to. You can have it whenever you want. It's just like the portion size is just more limited, but you still have the unconditional permission to have it.
Oh, absolutely, and you also have room for it. And actually, just something I want to go back to the menstrual cycle, just because I think it's worth addressing. So during the second half of the cycle, right, women's energy expenditure is up a little bit. Now, cravings are too, but it is, of course, possible to consciously, you can still keep calories under control. I don't want anybody here like, okay, nothing I can do about it. Like, it may be harder. But there are sort of two ways to look at that increased energy expenditure. Now, one, you can maintain your calorie levels where they are and probably lose a little bit more fat, right? You may get an extra 1,400 calories. It's just under a half a pound of fat, thereabouts, quarter kilo. Or you can go, okay, I've got 300 extra calories. If a small treat will help me not binge, I can have it. It's very much addressing that flexible approach. And I think I was I want to make sure I get credit for this. In the book, when I talk about this, I recommended chocolate medicinally. There are studies that are like, yes, women should allow this to one degree, or like, I'm not saying eat all you want, but if a little bit will help take the edge off. There's actually a paper I cited in the chapter that talks about setting up diet. And it was called the Menstraline study. And what they did is they wanted to compare a diet that was based around these menstrual cycle dynamics versus just a standard, very traditional, whatever I forget what country it was in. I want to say Sweden. It's like the traditional country dietary recommendations. And basically what they did was really interesting to me because I'd written the whole chapter and derived my recommendations. And then when I read their paper, they were the exact same. And I was like, okay, maybe I know what I'm talking about. But basically what they did is during the first half of the cycle, where women handled carbs a little bit better, they gave them a little bit higher carbs, a little bit lower dietary fat. I thought the protein should be higher, but I always do. Most diets don't have protein where I would like them. In the second half of the cycle, they did two things. One, they brought carbs down a little bit because of the insulin resistance. Dietary fat came up a little bit. It's not much. It's 10 or 15 grams. But if they wanted a small piece, I think they said 200 grams of dark chocolate, maybe. I'm American. I don't think in metric. Sorry. But if they wanted that during the second half of the cycle, They could, because their energy expenditure was up. And what they found was that adherence was better. And for the women that were adherent, fat loss, because of course it is. Like I said initially, we can't, I hate to use the word fix because it makes it sound like women are broken. They're not. We can't change the menstrual cycle. Well, we can with birth control. That's a whole separate, that's another day because that's too complicated. But it's not like we can't change it and we can try to ignore it, which is what we've typically done, or we can acknowledge the differences and work with them. And that's what they were doing. They're saying rather than just tell them just eat this generic diet, and they changed exercise a little bit too, and that's another separate topic. Let's work with it to see if we can give them dietary recommendations that will work with their physiology. And it worked better because, of course, it did. So that tying into the flexible eating type stuff with the higher calories, knowing that if you've got a couple hundred more calories to play with during the second half of the cycle, if having that couple hundred calories of whatever you're craving helps, and it doesn't have to be every day, right? One of my annoyances was the flexible eating people and also the critics. What people hear is you should be eating whatever you want every day. No, that's not what it's ever been about. It is if you want to include this in your diet within your calories, you can. Not that you have to, but if you want it and you can fit it in, you can do that and it's fine. And this is kind of that approach, kind of putting all this together. So yeah, I absolutely think there is merit to bringing calories up and bringing training, because everything else just sort of tends to adapt upwards to a point, right? You can't just go forever and ever and ever.
Yeah.
But even getting a woman who may be maintaining or binging or whatever at 1,200 to eating 1,600 to 1,800, training more effectively, training more efficiently, not binging, being able to eat more flexibly, that will generate far better long-term results. And if she's having menstrual cycle dysfunction, may reverse that too.
And in fact, you say that the body composition changes or improves even in that higher calories.
Yeah, it's very strange, and it seems like it should break a lot of physical rules, and I think a lot of that is coming out of you're typically improving the overall diet in terms of its composition, but also you can train with a higher quality. You can train because you're not just tired all the time.
You're sleeping better as well.
Oh, yes, and there's data on that, absolutely, that getting too little sleep on a diet causes, God, what was it? Like 25-30% more lean body mass loss and less fat loss. And yeah, so it can all become a very negative cycle with extreme dieting leads to binging, leads to more extreme dieting, leads to plateaus, leads to more training, which leads to injuries, or you can make it into a very feed-forward cycle. Now, what I've found, and I'm sure this is your experience too, the hard part is getting women to do it.
I know.
Right? This is the solution. Even with dietary protein, many women, they don't have a taste for it. They think they should drop it out because take your pick. They'll get bulky. The fat content's too high. Fat makes you fat. Whatever the reason is doesn't really matter. Getting them to do it is the hard part. But once you get them to do it for a month and it changes their life or raising their calories, getting them to, what do you mean eating more can make me lose more effectively? It breaks all logic, but it absolutely works.
It's funny because now, currently, I like 85% of my clients, I put them on a reverse straight away. Like, you've been chronically dieting for so long. I want you to eat more calories. You have to eat more protein, though. You have to train harder. And we're going to change your relationship with food. We're going to optimize your consistency, and you're going to see results. But you have to trust me because it's so hard.
It really is. When I first started training people, I knew like three things. Like I was straight out of college, so I thought I knew everything, and I knew on a level that eating too little and training too much was bad. I couldn't have told you why. And I would have those clients women starve themselves, too much exercise. And I'd be like, look, you got to trust, like if you'll just eat more and exercise less. But how can that work? I had one member I'll never forget her. She was eating some ridiculously low calorie number, doing 2 hours of aerobic activity. I was like, this isn't going to work. She went on holiday. She went like a week cruise. And what do you do when you're on holiday? She ate more and exercised less. She came back. She's like, I've lost 5 pounds, 2.5 kilos. I'm like, what have I been telling you? And she went right back to over dieting. It was, and I do think this was the 90s. Like I said, the internet wasn't a thing. All the information was even worse than it is now. Yeah. Because it was all terrible women's magazines. Like I read them all the time, the stuff at the grocery store checkout, because they're hilarious. They're like, lose 10 kilos in a week I got to read them because they just make me angry and I like being angry. But now there's at least enough women out there who are doing what you've talked about, who you can be like, look, they were right where you are now. And they did this. or I've seen a very big difference, I'm sure you have too, women's attitude towards heavier weight training or more intense weight training has really changed in the last decade, right? In the 90s and the 80s, you just didn't see women in the weight room. And if you did, it was sets of 50 with a kilo and a half, like, don't want to lose your femininity, your ovaries will fall out, you'll never get a man, whatever the nonsense was.
The pink dumbbells?
Yeah, oh, exactly. We've got a celebrity trainer over here that says, don't lift more than a kilo and a half, you'll get bulky. Look, any woman that's had a child is lifting more than that, right? The smallest children. But anyway, but now women can go on Instagram, and Instagram can be very damaging, make no mistake. There's a lot of, it can make people crazy by comparing them, but they're also seeing women that are just lifting incredible poundages, incredible weights. And as much as this is a very loaded term, and I want to use it very carefully, they're retaining their femininity. Realize I live in America and my country is nuts. And if I don't use very careful language, I get in trouble. Right? Women are feminine by nature of being women, but women listeners know what I mean by that, sort of the traditional standards. These women, they're not bulky. They're not overmuscular. They don't look like men. And I hate to use terms like that too, but you know what I'm saying. And they see that and they go, okay, like I've seen women's powerlifting explode from a handful of women. Texas, we have women's only meets now. There's so many women competing because they've realized that being strong is awesome. And doing this, you don't get judged for anything but what you lifted. Nobody cares what you look at, what you weigh, how skinny you are, any of that. And I'm not saying that women have to necessarily power lift. Some women are not built for that physically, psychologically. But when you get women, and you see this with your clients, from going and lifting the pink dumbbells 50 times, you go, look, just pick a weight that will challenge you for the last 2 or 3 over 15 reps. It doesn't be the hardest thing you've ever done. It will challenge you. And after a month, A, their body composition changes. B, I find many women get very addicted in a good way to being strong. Suddenly they notice like, wow, things I couldn't do a month ago, I can do. One of my funniest stories, I trained a lot of women when I was younger, and I had a female trainee, and she got very strong, especially lower body. And I guess she and her husband were wrestling, and she basically leg pressed him and threw him across the room. And I got a letter from him. She brought me that said, if you make her any stronger, I'm going to stop writing the checks, or signing the checks. She loved it. Him not so much. But yeah, a lot of women, they just really like feeling strong. And some will, decide they want to get into power, and others don't. That's fine. I'm not saying one is better than the other. But when you get them to do that, and you can go, look, here are these female athletes. Here's Steffi Cohen, who deadlifts 275 kilos, right? It's mind-boggling.
And she's Venezuelan like me.
What's that?
She's Venezuelan like me.
Is she? Okay, I PM with her every once in a while. I was not aware of that, but like she's a monster. I mean, in a good way. Like she's amazing. She's so strong. And there are certainly these images in social media now that it's not drugged up female bodybuilders who are 180 pounds because they're on testosterone, but are still lifting the world and performing at the highest level of athletics and all these different sports. And like I said, I'm old. I've watched this all change from the 80s when women just weren't allowed to do sports, so the sports they were allowed to do were, whatever, girly sports, gymnastics, figure skating, ballet, Now you've got female boxing, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, rugby, which is scary in many, many ways. And the world has just changed. And in this sense, in a very, very, very good way. And intense weight training is very empowering for women. Like I'm preaching to the choir here. You know this better than I do. But yeah, once you get them to buy in, a month later, you've got them.
Thank you so much for your time. I had such a great time.
Me too.
So I'll see you very soon.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for being watching. I appreciate you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you have any questions or any comments, please comment below. And I'll be sure I'll answer to this as soon as I can.